My mother-in-law looked me dead in the eyes and said, "Honestly, sweetheart, we always knew you weren't quite right for our family." She smiled when she said it. Actually smiled. And my husband, the man I had just handed my entire inheritance to, $112,000 that my father left me when he died, stood right beside her and said nothing. That was the moment I understood. Not suspected. Not feared. Understood. They had planned this from the beginning. I need to back up because none of this makes sense without the full picture, and I want you to understand exactly how it happened. How a reasonably intelligent woman with a good head on her shoulders ended up handing over her dead father's life savings to a family that had already decided she wasn't worth keeping. My name is Mia. I was 31 when I met Nathan at a conference in Chicago. He was presenting on commercial real estate investment trends, and I was there representing the nonprofit I worked for, looking for partnership opportunities. He was confident without being loud about it, the kind of man who doesn't need to take up all the air in a room because he already knows he belongs there. We talked for 3 hours that night at the hotel bar. He remembered the name of my father's hometown when I mentioned it once, in passing, 40 minutes into the conversation. I noticed that. I filed it away as a good sign. We dated long distance for 8 months. I was in Nashville, he was based in Atlanta, before I made the move. Left my job, left my apartment, left the neighborhood where I'd lived for 6 years. People thought I was crazy. My best friend Joanna sat across from me at our usual coffee place and said, "Mia, you've known this man for less than a year." And I said, "I know. But I also know him." I was so certain. That certainty is the thing I have the hardest time forgiving myself for. His family was Atlanta old money, or at least they presented that way. His mother, Margaret, I called her that from the start because she insisted, said Mrs. Myritt. Caldwell makes me feel ancient. Was polished in the way that only comes from decades of practice. She hugged me at our first meeting and told me I had wonderful energy. His father, Gerald, shook my hand firmly and said Nathan had told him a lot about me. His younger brother was finishing his MBA. Everyone was pleasant. Everything was warm. The wedding was small by their standards. 120 guests at a venue outside Atlanta, white garden roses everywhere, a band that played Norah Jones covers during cocktail hour. My dad cried when he walked me down the aisle. He died 14 months later, a stroke, sudden, no warning, and he left me everything he had. $112,000, the savings of a man who drove the same Ford F-150 for 17 years and never once took a vacation that wasn't driving distance. I kept the money in a separate account for almost a year. It felt wrong to touch it. It felt like if I spent it, he would really be gone. Then Nathan came home one Tuesday night with that look on his face, the one I would later learn to recognize as the look he wore when he needed something. He sat down at our kitchen table and laid it out plainly, which I now understand was strategic. The straightforwardness was designed to feel like trust. His father's development company was in serious trouble. They'd over-leveraged on a commercial project in Buckhead that had gone sideways when a major anchor tenant pulled out. The bank was threatening to call their construction loan. If that happened, they'd lose the property, lose their equity stake, and Gerald's personal guarantee meant their house was on the line. The family home. 3 generations of Caldwells. "How much?" I asked. He looked at the table. 112. I felt the number land in my chest like a stone dropping into still water. "Nathan, that's my father's money." "I know." He reached across and took my hand. "I wouldn't ask if there was any other way. I've already maxed out everything I can access. My parents are too proud to go to outside investors right now. It would have to be disclosed and the timing with their other projects." He shook his head. "It's a bridge loan, Mia. 6 months, 8 at the most, and we pay it back with interest. The project will close. The numbers work. I want to be honest about this part, because I've replayed it many times in the years since. I had doubts. Real ones. Something in my stomach said, wait. But Nathan had never lied to me, or rather, I had never caught him lying to me, which I now understand is a different thing entirely. And I thought of Margaret holding my hand at my father's funeral, of Gerald's firm handshake, of all the Sunday dinners where I had started to feel like I actually belonged somewhere. I transferred the money in 3 installments over 6 weeks. The project did not close in 6 months. 8 months passed, then 10. Nathan's answers became shorter. He stopped bringing it up unless I did. And when I did, there was always a reason. Market conditions, permitting delays, a contractor dispute. I started keeping notes. Not because I was suspicious yet, just because I needed to keep things straight in my own mind. It was around month 11 that I noticed the charge on our joint credit card statement. A hotel in Savannah. 4 nights. During the week, Nathan had told me he was in Birmingham for meetings. I did not confront him immediately. This is the part of myself I'm most proud of, looking back, that I went cold instead of going loud. I opened a new email account he didn't know about. I started taking photographs of documents. I called a friend from college who is now a forensic accountant and asked her, hypothetically, what questions a person should be asking if they thought their money had not gone where they were told it had gone. The questions led to answers I wasn't ready for. The Buckhead project had received the capital it needed, but not from me alone. There were other investors, institutional ones, who had come in 4 months before I transferred my inheritance. My money had not saved the project. The project was never in danger of failing at the point Nathan came to me. My money had gone into a separate LLC, one I had no paperwork on, no stake in, nothing. I hired a private investigator. His name was Marcus, and he was quiet and methodical, and within 3 weeks he handed me a folder that I had to sit with for 2 full days before I could think clearly again. Nathan had been having an affair for at least 18 months. The woman was not a stranger to the family. She was the interior designer his mother had hired for 3 of their renovation projects. Margaret knew. I don't know exactly when I understood that part fully, but it settled into me slowly, like water working into stone. Margaret knew, and she had kept inviting me to Sunday dinners and calling me sweetheart, and the whole time the 4 of them, Nathan, his father, his mother, and a woman I had met at a Caldwell family Christmas party and made pleasant conversation with, had been waiting for the moment to be right. My father's money was right. That was the moment. I went to see an attorney. Then I went to see a second one. The news was not good. Money transferred between spouses during a marriage is murky territory, and without proof of fraud, I was looking at a long and expensive fight with uncertain outcomes. But fraud, my second attorney told me, was absolutely provable here if I had the right documentation. The LLC filings, the timeline, the fact that Nathan had materially misrepresented the purpose and necessity of the transfer. That was a paper trail. I needed more of it. I went back to Marcus. I also went back to my friend the forensic accountant, this time not hypothetically. And then I did something that still surprises me when I think about it. I got a new haircut, shorter, sharper. I bought 3 suits I could not afford on the nonprofit salary I had gone back to when I stopped being able to pretend my marriage was fine. I opened a LinkedIn profile under a slightly different professional framing. Mia Lowe, independent real estate capital consultant. Not a lie, exactly. I had spent 4 years adjacent to the real estate investment world through Nathan. I knew the language. I knew who the players were. I knew what questions sounded smart and which ones revealed you didn't belong. I started showing up at the same industry events the Caldwells attended. The first time Margaret saw me across a room, I watched her face go through 4 expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise, confusion, recalibration, dismissal. By the time she looked away, she had decided I was not worth worrying about. That miscalculation was the foundation of everything that followed. I did not approach her. I spoke to other people, made myself visible, built small credibilities. I let the name Mia Lowe start to circulate. It took about 6 weeks before someone introduced us as though we'd never met. Margaret looked at me with that practiced warmth and shook my hand and said she was sure we'd spoken before. I don't think so, I said pleasantly. I'd remember. She smiled. I smiled. We moved on. Meanwhile, Marcus had been busy. What he found went beyond the LLC. Gerald Caldwell had a pattern, not just with my money, but with the small investment group he'd run in the late 2000s that had dissolved in a way that left several of its members with substantial losses and no clear accounting of where the capital had gone. One of those members, a retired teacher named Phyllis, had tried to pursue it legally and been quietly paid a settlement with an NDA attached. She had never been able to talk about it. until Marcus explained that the NDA didn't cover her speaking to law enforcement and that someone was now building a case. I want to be careful here. I am not a hero in this story. I know that. The woman I was becoming during those months, focused, cold, operating on a kind of controlled fury that I mistook for clarity. She was capable of things that the Mia who cried over her father's hospital blanket would not have recognized. I kept a spreadsheet. I tracked every connection, every business relationship, every piece of leverage. I stopped sleeping well. I told myself I was delivering justice, and that was true, partly. But partly I was just trying to feel less like a fool. The thing that cracked it open was the charity gala. The Caldwells hosted an annual fundraiser for a children's hospital. It was their most visible community piece, the event they used to maintain their reputation as good people who happened to be wealthy. I attended as Mia Lowe on the guest list through a connection I'd made in my new professional life. I was there specifically because Marcus had told me that a board member of Gerald's current development firm, a man named Arthur Reyes, who had started asking his own questions about the company's financials, would be there. I found Arthur at the bar during the cocktail hour. He was the kind of person who watches doorways. We recognized something in each other inside the first 5 minutes. I told him who I really was. He told me what he had been finding. By the end of the night, we had agreed to share information. It unraveled faster than I expected after that. Arthur had documentation of tax irregularities. Income moved through the company in ways that had never been reported. Combined with what Marcus had found about the earlier investment group and the evidence of Nathan's misrepresentation to me, we had enough to bring to both the IRS and the State Attorney General's office. My attorney, who by this point had become something closer to a general than a lawyer, coordinated everything. We timed the filing to land the same week that the Caldwells were closing on a major new acquisition, the worst possible moment for their financing to come under scrutiny. 2 things happened in the days that followed. First, the acquisition fell apart when the other party's due diligence team flagged the investigation. Second, Nathan called me. "I know it's you," he said. His voice was different than it had ever been with me, stripped of the confidence I had mistaken for character. "I don't know how you did this, but I know it was you." "I'm not sure what you're referring to," I said. "Mia." He paused. "We can still fix this. I made mistakes, I know that. But if you stop whatever you're doing right now, we can sit down and work something out. I can get your money back." I let the silence stretch. Then I said, "The time for working things out was before you stood in our kitchen and looked me in the eyes while you lied to me. Have a good evening, Nathan." I hung up and sat with my hands in my lap for a long time. 3 weeks later, I got a call from my attorney. The AG's office had reached out. They wanted my full cooperation in exchange for a favorable position in the civil recovery proceedings. I said yes without hesitation. The forensic accountant I'd been working with was formally retained by the state. Phyllis, the retired teacher who had signed the NDA a decade ago, was finally going to have her story heard. The part that still catches me sometimes is Margaret. I had expected her to fight. She had always been so composed, so socially armored, that I assumed she would lawyer up immediately and present a front of perfect outrage. Instead, when it became clear that Gerald's cooperation with investigators was the only thing that might keep him out of federal court, she called me directly, not through attorneys. She called my cell phone at 7 in the morning. "I owe you an apology," she said. Her voice was different too. Smaller. Not for everything, but for some things. I didn't say anything. "What happened with your father's money was wrong. I told Gerald that. I want you to know I said so at the time." A pause. "It didn't matter. I understand if that doesn't mean anything to you." "It doesn't," I said. "But I heard you." Gerald cooperated with investigators. Nathan's affair partner, the interior designer, ended that relationship the week the news broke publicly. Nathan moved into an apartment in Midtown that I'm told is considerably smaller than what he's accustomed to. The development company restructured under new leadership. Arthur Reyes, it turned out, was exactly the kind of person who rebuilds broken things carefully and with integrity. The last I heard, the company was operating cleanly. As for my father's money, I recovered $89,000 through the civil proceedings. Not all of it. Not the interest Nathan had promised. but $89,000 that came back to me through attorneys and court orders, and 2 years of work that I am still not entirely sure was good for me. I put $50,000 of it into a donor-advised fund that I use to support financial literacy programs, specifically ones that target women going through divorce. The rest went toward paying off the debt I'd accumulated funding my own investigation. The version of me that exists now is not the version Nathan married, or the version his family thought they were dealing with. She is quieter in some ways, more careful with trust, which sounds like a sad thing, but doesn't always feel that way. She has better instincts about who watches doorways. I still have the spreadsheet. I keep it not because I need it, but because sometimes I open it and I look at all the columns. Dates, contacts, amounts, documents, follow-up actions, and I think about that woman sitting at a laptop at 2 a.m, running on coffee and controlled anger, building something out of the worst thing that ever happened to her. She wasn't entirely admirable, but she was not nothing, and she brought them all the way down. I've thought a lot about what I would tell a younger version of myself, the one who moved cities for a man she'd known less than a year, who wired $112,000 into an account and told herself it was love and not fear. I don't know that I'd tell her not to do it. I'm not sure warnings work that way. But I think I'd tell her to watch people more carefully, not what they say, what they do when they think no one's paying attention. Nathan never thought I was paying attention. That was his real mistake, and in some ways it was the most expensive one he ever made. The thing about people who take advantage of trust is that they depend on a version of you staying fixed. They need you to remain the person they sized up at the beginning, the one who believes in the good of others, who gives the benefit of the doubt, who mistakes composure for character. Nathan and Margaret had built their entire plan around a Mia who would hurt quietly, who would sign the divorce papers and go back to Nashville and eventually stop asking questions. They were so confident in that version of me that they never once considered I might become someone else entirely. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the money, not even the betrayal. It's the certainty they had. Margaret called me sweetheart for 3 years while knowing what was coming. Gerald shook my hand at my father's funeral, and not one of them lost sleep over it, I'm sure, because they had already decided who I was and what I was capable of. Small, manageable, forgettable. What they didn't account for is that grief changes people. Losing my father the way I did, suddenly, no goodbye, just a phone call and then a hospital hallway, that broke something open in me that was never quite the same after. I think by the time Nathan sat down at our kitchen table with that look on his face, I was already someone different than the woman he'd married. I just didn't know it yet. The version of me that built the spreadsheet, that met Marcus in a coffee shop and hired my forensic accountant friend, and showed up to industry events as Mia Lowe. She wasn't born from rage alone. She was born from the very particular clarity that arrives when you stop hoping someone will turn out to be who you needed them to be. When you finally accept what's actually in front of you. I'm not proud of every choice I made during those 2 years. I operated in a kind of cold tunnel vision that I now recognize was not entirely healthy. I told myself it was justice, and it was, partly, but it was also me refusing to be the person they had decided I was. It was stubbornness as much as principle. What I know now is that the actions we take in our worst moments are still actions. They still have weight. Nathan and Gerald and Margaret didn't just lose a legal fight. They lost because of choices they had been making for years, compounding quietly, a structure built on the assumption that people like Phyllis and people like me would never compare notes. When we did, it fell. Not because of anything dramatic, because the foundation had always been rotten. I think about Phyllis sometimes, a retired teacher who signed an NDA a decade ago and never got to say out loud what had been done to her. When my attorney told me she could finally talk to investigators, that was the moment it stopped being about my father's money. That was the moment it became something worth the cost of what it took out of me. That's the only version of cause and effect I believe in. Not fate, not the universe balancing some cosmic ledger. Just the plain, slow arithmetic of choices. Theirs and then mine.